My name is Anita Henderson, and last week I buried my husband of 40 years. Melton, a man whose quiet strength and soft-spoken humor kept me tethered to the world during the darkest years of my life. The funeral was modest, just as he would have wanted, with pale lilies and his favorite hymn humming through the church like a warm current of memory. But I didn't feel the warmth. Not from the flowers, not from the guests, and certainly not from the two people who mattered most now, my son Kendry and his wife Jess. Melton had been sick for a while. I took care of him until the very end, bathed him, fed him, tucked him into bed each night, even when he forgot who I was. He called me Nina toward the end. Nina was his sister, who died before he turned 10. It broke my heart to hear him call for her instead of me, but I never corrected him. That was how you loved someone until the end. You let them forget who you were if it meant they could leave this world without confusion. But no amount of care or love prepared me for what would follow. It started with the reading of the will. The lawyer's office was cold, air-conditioned too sharply for comfort. Kendry sat stiff beside me in a gray blazer he probably borrowed from someone at work, while Jess scrolled through her phone, chewing gum with slow, deliberate clicks of her jaw like she was counting down the minutes until she could go shopping. The lawyer, Mr. Billings, was an older man with white whiskers and watery eyes. He offered me a soft glance before beginning. To Anita Henderson, my beloved wife, I leave the old summer house in Wexford Hollow and full rights to the trust fund established under her name. Jess made a sound like a snort. To my son, Kendry, I leave our family home, the Henderson residence on Tully Avenue, and the remainder of the financial estate. Jess didn't wait for the full statement to end. She laughed. Well, that's generous. A crumbling wooden box in the woods for her, and the real assets for us. Mr. Billings coughed. The house in Wexford Hollow has no mortgage and sits on 10 acres of private forest. I've seen it, she cut in, not even looking up from her phone. It's falling apart. No insulation, no plumbing. You can keep your creepy cabin in the woods, Anita. Just get out of our lives and leave the rest to people who actually have something to build. I turned my head toward Kendry. He wasn't looking at me. He was nodding. Maybe it's for the best, Ma, he muttered. You never liked the city anyway. The house, Tully. It's too big for you now. Too big for me. This was the house where I'd raised him, where I sat awake night after night when he was 5, nursing him through the fevers that came after his accident. This was the house where he spilled juice on every sofa, left scratches on the dining room floor from dragging chairs too roughly, and where he once taped a picture of his dream car on the bathroom mirror to manifest it. That house. Too big for me. And the summer house. The last time I'd been there was 15 years ago. Melton had kept it up himself for a while, paying a man named Reggie to clear the leaves off the roof and another neighbor to mow the grass. But after Melton's diagnosis, we stopped going. Wexford Hollow was 2 hours from the city, and even more from Kendry's trendy new suburb, where Jess insisted on organic lawn care and only bought candles from companies with French-sounding names. When I didn't say anything, Jess leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. It's not personal. We just want to start fresh. I mean, this whole thing, Melton dying, it's like the end of an era, right? Right. End of an era. My husband, my life. Mr. Billings asked if I had questions. I said no. There was nothing to ask. My son had just agreed to exile me to a house that hadn't seen light in over a decade. His wife had made it clear that my presence in their lives was a problem they were eager to solve. I didn't cry. Not there. That came later, back at the house. My house. The one I'd have to leave. I packed slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of grief. Melton's jackets still hung in the front closet. I folded each one carefully, taking none of them with me. What would be the point? He wasn't in them anymore. Jess came by on the second night with a contractor to measure some walls. She didn't speak to me. The man she brought looked embarrassed. When he saw the bedroom, he hesitated. Did someone just pass away here? He asked quietly. I said nothing. Jess answered for me. Yeah, this whole place needs to be gutted. It still smells like old people. The next morning, I left before dawn. Kendry had already changed the name on the mailbox. Just K. Henderson. No mention of Anita. I drove the narrow road up to Wexford Hollow, with a car full of boxes and a heart full of silence. The trees along the highway didn't comfort me the way they once did. The sun was just rising as I pulled into the gravel driveway of the summer house, its silhouette crooked and gray in the cold light of early morning. There were spider webs over the porch railings, moss on the roof. The shutters hung crooked. The front door creaked in protest as I unlocked it. Inside smelled of dust and wood rot, but it was mine. All mine. I stepped into the living room and let the door fall shut behind me. The air was heavy. I set my bags down on the old leather couch, sagging with time and memory, and looked around. There was no television, no microwave, no dishwasher. Just a fireplace, a few books, and a radio that hadn't worked since the 90s. The silence was complete. I sat there for an hour, maybe 2, not crying. I'd done enough of that. I just sat, letting the new reality settle into my bones. My son didn't want me. My daughter-in-law never had. And the man who loved me for 40 years was gone. I'd spent my whole life building a home, only to be handed the keys to a forgotten one as a parting gift. The worst part? They thought I'd just disappear quietly. I stood up, walked over to the kitchen. The faucet sputtered before water began to run. Cold, clean. The electricity worked, barely. As I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye. A faint outline in the floorboards behind the pantry. A square shape, just slightly misaligned with the grain of the wood. A hatch. I didn't open it then. Not yet. But something shifted in me as I stared at it. A whisper of curiosity, a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. I turned away. Tomorrow, I would clean, fix the shutters, maybe go into town for supplies. And then, when I had the strength, I would find out what was hiding beneath the floor. Because Melton never mentioned a basement, and I'd lived in that house long enough to know it hadn't always been there. The next morning, I woke up wrapped in silence. The kind of silence you only find in old places, where even the walls seem to breathe a little slower. The air in the bedroom was cold, but the sun filtering through the thin floral curtains was warm enough to make me pull the blanket tighter around me, not wanting to move. But I had to. Melton would have risen early. He never let the day get ahead of him. So I forced myself out of bed, pushed my feet into slippers, and shuffled toward the kitchen where I boiled water on the stove for coffee. There was no coffee maker, just an old tin kettle and the last of what I found in a drawer. Instant coffee in a faded jar that smelled like ash and winter mornings. The taste was terrible. I drank it anyway. Then I started cleaning. The house had clearly been untouched for years. Cobwebs in the corners. Dust so thick on the windowsills I could write my name in it. A layer of grime on every surface. I opened all the windows to let in fresh air, though I didn't know if I was trying to cleanse the house or myself. Maybe both. By noon, I had wiped down the kitchen, shaken out the old curtains, and was working on the bookshelf in the living room. Most of the books were paperbacks swollen with age and mildew. Gardening guides, old thrillers, a few cookbooks from the 70s. But tucked between 2 volumes was a leather envelope. Yellowed and cracked at the edges. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, neatly folded, tied with a silk ribbon that had turned from red to brown with time. I sat on the couch, my rubber glove still on, and untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. The first letter was dated June 3rd, 1949. Addressed simply, "My dearest Lynette, the surveyors returned today. They say there's copper, deep but clean. You were right about the eastern ridge. I don't know what it means for us yet, but I can't stop thinking that we might have something here, something real, something that could change everything." The signature at the bottom was W.G. Harper, my grandfather. I blinked, then looked again at the envelope. Every letter was written in the same hand. ink that had faded to brown. Some were stained with water, maybe tears. I kept reading. If your father knew you were helping me, if he knew you were slipping me the geological maps from the county office, he'd banish you from the family. And yet you keep doing it. You are more fearless than anyone I've ever known, Lynette. I owe you more than I can say. I stared at the fireplace, unsure what I was reading. Grandpa Harper had died before I turned 15. A quiet man, a carpenter by trade, lived simply, loved gardening. He never mentioned Lynette. My grandmother's name was Ethel, but there were at least 30 letters here. Some passionate, some fearful, some full of maps and sketches tucked into the folds. One described a plan to bring in equipment after dark to avoid attention. Another listed coordinates, latitude and longitude. I didn't understand most of it, but the word copper kept appearing. So did the phrase, Wexford Hollow Ridgeline. That was this land, this house, this forgotten summer home my son called a dump. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath me felt different, less like decaying wood and more like something heavier, something buried. I put the letters aside, unable to sit still anymore. I needed to talk to someone. The only person I could think of was Reddy Morris, the local caretaker who used to clear the driveway for Melton during winter. He lived at the edge of the forest in a mobile home strung with tin wind chimes. I'd seen the flicker of smoke from his chimney when I arrived yesterday. I found him seated on an overturned crate in front of a smoking fire barrel, a chipped mug of something steaming in his hands. "Well, I'll be," he said, rising slowly as I approached. "Anita Henderson, back in Wexford Hollow. Thought you'd never return." "Didn't think I would either," I said. "Mind if I ask you something?" He squinted. "You always could. Melton said you were the one with the brains." I ignored the comment. "Did you ever hear anything about this land? About copper? About my grandfather?" His expression changed, like I'd asked something both ridiculous and important. "Harper?" he said slowly. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a minute. Old William Harper. Your granddad was obsessed with the rocks up there. Used to walk the ridge for hours. Had this crazy theory about a copper belt running through the southeast curve. Always talking about mineral rights and veins. Folks laughed at him, said he was digging for ghosts. But was he wrong?" Reddy looked down at his boots, then back at me. "Back in the 80s, some fella from out west came snooping around. Geologist type, paid your granddad a visit. Next day, Harper ran him off. Said something about protecting what was his. I asked him once, and all he said was, 'It ain't time yet.' Then he stopped talking about it altogether. My mouth felt dry. Do you know if there are records? Anything? Proof?" He scratched his beard. "If there is, it'd be buried in the county records. Or maybe here. That old man had hiding spots everywhere in that house. He didn't trust banks or city folks. If there's something worth finding, it's already on your land." I thanked him and walked back toward the summer house, my boots crunching over leaves. The air felt sharper now, and I could smell the first hint of rain in the wind. When I got back inside, I pulled the hatch open behind the pantry. Beneath it, a narrow staircase, steep and unlit. I found a flashlight and climbed down, my knees trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. At the bottom was a crawl space, just 6 feet wide, with a workbench covered in dust and metal filings, shelves of glass jars holding old nails, coins, and something that looked like unrefined ore. I wiped one clean. It was heavy, reddish in color, and stamped with the symbol CU Copper. My heart pounded in my chest. This was no summer cabin. This was a secret. And now that secret was mine. By sunset, I had stacked every letter in chronological order. I made notes. I marked the maps. I began searching the house, room by room, for anything that might link the coordinates to real land surveys. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't just a woman sorting through old boxes and faded linens. This was opportunity. And if there was even a grain of truth to what my grandfather believed, then my exile had just become my inheritance. I wasn't a burden anymore. I was sitting on something valuable, and Kendry and Jess, and they had no idea what they'd just given away. The morning fog clung low over the ground, like breath frozen in time. It was just after 6 when I poured hot water over my second cup of instant coffee and lit a fire in the hearth to chase off the chill. Something about this house, this land, made my nerves tighten like piano wires. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the awareness that something enormous had been left buried for decades, and now I was the one standing over the unmarked grave with a shovel. I spent the morning combing through every drawer, every closet, every hidden crevice I could find. I wore old gardening gloves from the shed, because half the boxes were splintered or covered in spider webs, and the smell of damp paper clung to my sleeves. Behind a false panel in the hallway linen closet, beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts, I found a metal lockbox. Inside were documents, not family photos or recipes, not tax returns or insurance bills, but maps, reports, and typed letters on company letterhead. The first thing I saw was a folded topographic survey of Wexford Hollow, marked in red ink with hand-drawn lines along the ridge. My grandfather's notes were all over it. Dates, elevation readings, chemical abbreviations I barely understood, and small circles labeled sample site with numbers like 1.13% and 2.04% next to them. The red ink was still vibrant, somehow untouched by the passage of time. Underneath were typed reports from the Department of Mineral Resources, stamped and signed from the early 1970s. They detailed moderate to rich copper presence in subsoil samples collected across the southeastern corridor of Wexford Hollow, and made recommendations for further evaluation to determine economic feasibility of low-impact extraction. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. This wasn't a theory. This was a proven mineral deposit, and it was mine. Near the bottom of the box was a yellowed envelope, unopened and still sealed with a company logo on the back. I slid it open with a knife and pulled out a crisp letter dated July 17th, 1978. Dear Mr. William G. Harper, after reviewing the geological reports and surveying the land in question, we would like to formally extend an offer to purchase the mineral rights for the Wexford Hollow property at a price of $380,000, contingent upon the results of one final core sample analysis. Please contact us no later than August 15th if you wish to proceed with this opportunity. Sincerely, Jonathan L. Miles Blackwell, Minerals and Holdings. I stared at the number. $380,000 in 1978 was well over $1 million today, maybe more, and he never accepted. I checked the envelope again. No signature, no reply letter. Just a red ink scribble on the back of the offer. No, it stays in the family. One day, she'll need it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She could only mean me. Or perhaps someone he hoped would come after him with more sense than Kendry ever showed. Beneath the mining documents, folded in half and held together with a rusted paperclip, were notes in Melton's handwriting. He had neat penmanship, always wrote in blue ink, always slightly slanted to the right. I knew it the moment I saw it. If anything happens to me before I can update the will, let her have the summer house. They won't want it. Jess hates nature, and Kendry never listened about what's under that land. She'll find it. I know she will. I've made sure the bank accounts will cover her until she does. My fingers tightened around the page. I read it again and again, until the words sank in fully. Melton had known. He had planned this. He'd never told me, not directly, but he'd laid the trail like breadcrumbs, trusting that if I was pushed hard enough, I'd follow them, that I'd figure it out. That maybe being cast aside would force me to see the gift he had left hidden beneath my feet. A house that no one wanted, a plot of land that wasn't worth anything, and buried underneath it, a copper reserve no one had touched in half a century. I sat back on the floor and tried to breathe. My heart thudded like it did the day Kendry first walked on his own, fast, heavy, full of disbelief. If the current estimates were right, and copper prices had only gone up, this property could be worth millions. Millions that Jess had laughed at. Millions that Kendry had tossed aside. And they'd sent me here, smug in their victory, like I was trash left on the curb. I stood up slowly, a new kind of fire burning in my chest. My knees cracked, and I ignored it. My hands were stiff from digging through boxes, but I didn't care. I felt something I hadn't felt since I was young and working full shifts at the diner to pay for Kendry's piano lessons. Power. Not just money, not just ownership. Possibility. I wasn't helpless, I wasn't dependent. I wasn't a burden to be quietly shuffled out of sight. I was a woman with mineral rights. I was a woman with land. And now, thanks to my husband and grandfather, I was a woman with leverage. I spent the rest of the day at the old kitchen table, organizing what I'd found. I stacked the letters, maps, reports, and survey notes into labeled folders. I cross-referenced the mineral rights application that had been started but never filed. I found a blank copy of the form in one of the boxes. My grandfather had kept it, perhaps hoping to finish it one day. I would finish it. Tomorrow I'd drive into town and visit the county clerk's office. I would check if the mineral rights had ever officially transferred. If they hadn't, I'd file the paperwork. I'd also visit a lawyer, not Mr. Billings, not someone in Kendry's circle, but someone local, someone discreet. If Jess and Kendry ever found out what this land was worth, they'd come crawling back, sweet smiles and crocodile tears, asking for forgiveness. I wanted to be ready, because I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted control. They had handed me this house, thinking they were cutting me out of their lives. But they'd forgotten something my grandfather knew. You don't throw away a woman who knows how to survive, especially not one sitting on top of copper veins. I had barely slept. The house creaked all night with the weight of secrets and wind. My mind spun with numbers, names, and the red ink of my grandfather's handwriting. $2 million. That was the new figure that circled my thoughts like a bird of prey. $2 million up front, and royalties. Melton must have known. He had to. The man was always cautious, deliberate, a creature of habit who avoided risk unless he saw a safety net in place. And yet for years, he brushed off my questions about the basement with vague excuses. Just tools, he'd say. Nothing but junk and bad wiring down there. I believed him because I trusted him, because I thought if there was something important, he'd tell me. But now I wasn't so sure. It was after lunch when I finally worked up the nerve to go down there again. I brought a flashlight, gloves, and a screwdriver. The hatch behind the pantry groaned when I opened it, the scent of damp earth rushing upward like breath from an open grave. The narrow stairs descended into blackness, and each step moaned beneath my weight. At the bottom, I expected to find the same cluttered crawl space I'd seen before. But this time, I looked closer. I ran my fingers along the cement walls, tapping gently, listening. One wall was different, hollow-sounding, patched with rough wooden panels instead of solid concrete. Behind an old cabinet, partially blocking the wall, was a seam. A thin vertical line in the wood, just wide enough to suggest a door. I moved the cabinet aside, dragging it inch by inch until I could get to the panel. It took a few minutes, but the screws came loose with enough force. The panel gave way with a shudder, revealing a narrow stone passage that curved out of sight, lined with timber supports. A mine shaft. A real one. I stood at the threshold, stunned. The air smelled of rust and stone, and something older, deeper. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The walls had been reinforced with wooden beams that looked newer than I expected. Not from my grandfather's time, but more recent. 10 feet in, I found crates. Dozens of them, all neatly stacked, labeled with dates from the past decade. 2016, 2017, 2019. I opened one. Inside were core samples, thick cylinders of rock, some labeled copper-bearing quartzite, others marked with chemical concentrations I couldn't understand but felt the weight of in my hands. Next to them were notebooks, detailed field logs, signed by licensed geologists. Melton hadn't just known. He'd been tracking the mine himself, deeper into the tunnel, in a dry alcove, lit by an old battery-powered lamp. I found a locked metal briefcase. I sat on a bench nearby, a rusting plank of steel fixed between two cinder blocks, and pried it open with my screwdriver. Inside were documents in plastic sleeves, a full-color geological report, the most recent dated March 2020, a three-dimensional scan of the mine layout, estimated yield charts, and then, tucked into a folder marked confidential, offer, a typed letter. 2. Mr. Melton Henderson, Mineral Acquisition Proposal, Wexford Hollow Property. Dear Mr. Henderson, after further analysis of your property's core samples and verified copper deposits, we are prepared to offer $2 million upfront for exclusive extraction rights, 6% net smelter return royalty on all copper extracted, guaranteed environmental protection and post-mining land restoration. Please find attached the proposed contract for your review. If accepted, our team is prepared to begin the permitting process immediately. Sincerely, Gregory Deems, Vice President. Red Ridge Mineral Group offer valid through September 30th, 2020. My mouth went dry. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't some forgotten theory from the 1970s, or my grandfather's obsession. This was recent. This was real. Melton had received an official multi-million-dollar offer and never told a soul. No wonder he insisted we never rent the place. No wonder he kept the title quiet, hidden under joint ownership but designated for me in his final will. This land, this old, rotting house that my daughter-in-law had mocked as that creepy summer shack, was the key to a private fortune. And they never knew. They had no idea what they gave away. I sat on the bench for a long time, surrounded by the smell of mineral-rich stone and history, my hands resting on the edges of that open briefcase. Somewhere upstairs, the wind creaked through the rafters. But down here, everything was still, like the mine itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide what to do. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just let the truth settle over me like armor. I was not poor. I was not alone. I was not desperate. I was holding an unclaimed offer worth $2 million and residual royalties that would last for years. It wasn't just about the money. It was the fact that Melton protected this for me, quietly, carefully, fully aware that Kendry and Jess would never appreciate its value, that they'd scoff at the isolation and the lack of plumbing, too distracted by countertops and school zones to imagine what lay beneath. And now, I had what they wanted most. Not the house, not even the land, but the upper hand. I closed the briefcase, clicked it shut, and carried it back up the stairs. With each step, I felt steadier, stronger, like the version of me who had once bent to everyone's needs was being left behind in that shaft. Back in the living room, I placed the briefcase on the table and stood in the silence of the house they abandoned me to. No more resentment, no more grief. Only clarity. Let them keep the big house. Let Jess paint over my walls and tear up my garden. Let them think they've won. Because from where I stood now, surrounded by maps, surveys, and confidential offers, I knew better. The morning I made the call, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Not dread. Not obligation. Not that dull sense of performing another task for someone who would never thank me. No, this was mine. The phone number listed on the Red Ridge Mineral Group's offer letter was still active. I waited until exactly 8:01 a.m. to dial, sitting at the kitchen table with the briefcase open beside me, a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, and the spring air leaking in through the cracked window above the sink. The old summer house smelled of pinewood and rising dust. But beneath it all was something else now. Potential. The receptionist answered in a clipped, polite voice. Red Ridge Mineral Group. How may I direct your call? I cleared my throat. I need to speak with Gregory Deems, Vice President of Acquisitions. May I ask who's calling? My name is Anita Henderson. I believe you made an offer to my late husband, Melton Henderson, regarding the Wexford Hollow property. There was a pause. One moment, Mrs. Henderson. The line went quiet for just long enough to make me doubt myself. I was, after all, a 71-year-old woman sitting alone in a crumbling cabin with a mine shaft under the floor. What if this was all a mistake? What if I was misreading the documents, misjudging the value? Then a voice came on the line. Deep, confident, curious. Mrs. Henderson, this is Greg Deems. I had no idea Mr. Henderson had passed. He was a very sharp man. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, I said carefully. He kept things close, including your offer. I just found it. Ah, that makes sense, he said, his tone warming. We always got the feeling he was sitting on something significant. I'm guessing you found the core samples and the site reports? I did, I said, steady now. And I want to discuss the offer, though the date has long passed. There was a beat of silence before he said, Mrs. Henderson, let me be perfectly honest. In the last few years, copper demand has increased dramatically, especially with the surge in electric infrastructure. The data from that site is, well, it's one of the most promising undeveloped veins on private land that we've seen in years. If you're open to negotiation, I think we can offer something much more attractive than what your husband received. I felt my pulse quicken. I'm listening. We'd be prepared to offer $4 million up front for exclusive mineral rights. No sale of the land required, just access. And in addition, we'd propose quarterly royalty payments tied to output. Based on initial projections, that would amount to anywhere between $350,000 to $500,000 per quarter. For the first 3 years, I didn't speak. I couldn't. Mrs. Henderson? He asked. I'm here, I said softly. Of course, we'd need to do another round of surveys, update the permitting process, and review the environmental protections. But we can have a team out there within 10 days. Does that sound agreeable? I looked out the window, where Jess once said, This dump isn't even worth a tax deduction. It does, I said. It sounds more than agreeable. We exchanged contact details. A meeting was scheduled. Contracts would be sent. And when I hung up, I set the phone down on the table and stared at my reflection in the glass pane of the window. I didn't look younger, or richer, or stronger. But I felt sovereign. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the background character to someone else's story. I wasn't the caretaker, the babysitter, the polite mother-in-law buying thoughtful Christmas gifts that no one remembered opening. I wasn't the woman who got the summer house like it was a punishment. I was the landowner of a multi-million-dollar mining opportunity. And Jess, oh, Jess, she'd told me to keep the creepy summer house. Be careful what you wish for. Just as I stood to refill my coffee, the phone buzzed again. I glanced down. Kendry. Of course, I stared at the name for a moment, thumb hovering over the answer button. I had half a mind to ignore it. But something inside me, something a little cruel, a little curious, wanted to hear his voice. I picked up, Hi, Ma, he said, a little too cheerful. How's the house treating you? I smiled faintly. Quieter than Tully Avenue. A pause. Yeah, I bet. Look, I wanted to check in, see how you're holding up. You've been gone a few weeks now. I said nothing. And, Jess and we've been under a bit of strain. The mortgage is hitting hard, especially with the renovations. Unexpected costs. You know how these things go. My smile sharpened. I wouldn't, I said. No renovations here. I still cook over a gas stove and sweep with a broom. He laughed weakly. Right. Well, that's actually why I'm calling. We were wondering if you might be able to help us out. Just a short-term thing? Jess had to dip into our savings to cover the tile order, and the contractor's charging more than expected. So, I said, my voice flat, you're asking me for money. I wouldn't put it like that. Then how would you put it? Ma. He hesitated, and then he did what he always did, leaned on sentiment. We're family. And I know things were tense after Dad passed, but we're still your people. You always said family comes first. Did I? I asked. I don't remember saying that the night you and Jess told me to grieve, pack up, and never come back. There was a pause. A thick one. Look, he said. We were all dealing with a lot of emotion. Jess didn't mean it like that. She meant every word, I replied, and you agreed with her. He was silent again. I didn't fill the space for him. Okay, he finally said, quieter now. So is that a no? I took a breath and looked down at the contract from Red Ridge, still sitting open on the table. I'm not your wallet, Kendry. I'm not your safety net. And I'm not someone you get to cast out one week and call for a loan the next. The line went dead silent. But we're struggling, he tried again, his voice faltering. Jess's hours got cut. We were counting on the equity from this house. I'm not responsible for your financial mistakes, I said calmly. I was your mother when you were a child. I raised you. But I am not your backer, your cosigner, or your fool. There was a long pause. Then he whispered, So that's it? You're done with us? I stood slowly, pressing my palm to the window glass. Outside, the wind rolled through the trees, brushing across the ridgeline where copper veins ran deep beneath the soil. I'm just beginning, I said. Goodbye, Kendry. And I ended the call. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I poured another cup of coffee and sat back at the table, the sun now streaming in across the documents that would change the rest of my life. They'd wanted me to disappear, but instead, I'd found something they never even looked for. My power. It was raining when I stepped out of the lawyer's office. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle that made everything look cleaner, newer. The sidewalk shone with reflections of brake lights and wet leaves. My shoes squelched slightly with each step, but I didn't mind. I had never enjoyed walking in the rain before, but that day I welcomed it, because for the first time in my 71 years, I had something no one could take from me: legal binding power. Her name was Cassandra Bell, and she was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She had silver-streaked hair in a tight braid, glasses she wore like armor, and a voice that could slice a man's excuses in half. She specialized in mineral rights and land contracts, the kind of lawyer who knew how to read between the lines and across generations of backdated property law. I found her through Margaret, Melton's accountant, who whispered her name like she was a scalpel meant for delicate, high-stakes incisions. It took less than 2 hours. The briefcase, the geological reports, the samples, the letter from Red Ridge, all of it laid out on her long glass desk. Cassandra read in silence, her eyes scanning each page with ruthless precision. When she finally looked up, she said 3 words. You're sitting on gold. Copper, I corrected, smiling a little. She didn't smile back. Same difference. In this market, copper's nearly as valuable, and a hell of a lot easier to move. If Red Ridge is offering $4 million up front plus royalties, it means they've already priced the site for double that in the first few years. You've got leverage. Let's use it. So we did. By the end of the day, the contract was signed. $4.25 million up front, 7% net smelter royalty, guaranteed for a minimum of 5 years. A clause ensuring that the land remained in my name, and another stipulating that the mining company was responsible for all cleanup and restoration after extraction. It was meticulous, fair, ironclad. Cassandra also helped me open 2 new bank accounts, one for the advance, one for the royalties, private, in my name alone, the kind of accounts no one in my family would ever be able to access without a court order. And even then, they'd have to pry every detail from a woman who'd learned, far too late, the cost of sharing too much with people who cared too little. I left the office with signed contracts, account access codes, and a clarity I had never known. I was no longer a dependent widow in exile. I was a landowner, a businesswoman, a stakeholder in a deal that would secure my independence for the rest of my life. The drive back to Wexford Hollow was quiet, long stretches of wet asphalt and pine trees. I stopped for groceries, fresh herbs, real coffee, olive oil that didn't come in a plastic jug. I bought myself a new kettle, a box of sea salt caramels, and a bottle of red wine. Not to celebrate, to savor. By the time I returned home, dusk had settled over the forest. The house stood as it always had, weather-worn and silent. But now I saw it differently. Not as a forgotten place, but as the very foundation of my freedom. I walked in, groceries in hand, set the bags down on the kitchen counter, and glanced at my phone charging by the window. 37 missed calls. I frowned. Then it buzzed again. Kendry. Again. Jess. 4 times in a row. I opened the call log. The earliest was from just before noon. The most recent, only 3 minutes ago. Voicemail after voicemail stacked behind the calls. I tapped the first one. Ma, hey, it's Kendry. Just hoping to catch you. Listen, could you give me a call back? Something weird came up. The county office called me about the deed on the Tully Avenue house, and, well, there's a small issue. Just call me, okay? I played the next. Ma, it's me again. So we spoke with someone at the zoning department, and they said the mineral rights under the house weren't transferred in the title when Dad passed. And, look, we're just a little confused. Can we talk? It's probably nothing, but we'd feel better if we could clear it up. Another. Anita, Jess here. Hey. So Kendry and I were just thinking maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I mean, emotions were high, right? And we were all grieving. We really miss you. We should have been more supportive. Another. Mom, please call us. We found something online about Red Ridge filing for a permit out near the Hollow, and we don't understand why we weren't told. Can we please talk? I let the phone drop onto the table with a thud. There it was. The shift. The sudden transformation from icy dismissal to frantic interest. Not because they missed me, not because they felt remorse, but because now there was something they wanted, something they thought might still be theirs, but they didn't understand. The land beneath their house, the house they inherited, was built on a parcel of land that still technically belonged to the original family trust, established by my grandfather, William Harper. The mineral rights had never been transferred in the title. My name was on that trust. Melton had never updated it, never carved it up for their benefit, because he knew they didn't deserve it. And now they were panicking, imagining pipes and drills beneath their granite countertops, picturing backhoes in their rose garden. Because the truth had finally cracked through their polished little world. They owned the house, but I owned the ground beneath it. My phone buzzed again. Kendry. This time a text. Mom! Please, can we talk? We made a mistake. Jess feels terrible. We just want to fix this. No, they didn't. They wanted access. They wanted a piece of something they never believed had value. Until I found it. Until I claimed it. And now that the old woman they banished had turned out to be worth millions, they were desperate to act like family again. I stood in the living room, staring at the phone. Then I walked over to the fireplace and dropped it into the soft red armchair. Let it ring, let them sweat, let them remember every word they said the day they told me to pack my grief and leave their lives. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped outside onto the porch. The night was cool. The stars shimmered faintly behind drifting clouds. Somewhere, beneath the soil, copper veins ran silently through the earth, untouched, waiting. Like they had been waiting for me. Let Jess and Kendry chase their fear. I had already found my freedom. It was around 10 in the morning when the knock came. Not the quick, neighborly kind of knock. No, this one had rhythm. Deliberate. The kind of knock someone uses when they're trying to pretend they're welcome before you've even answered the door. I knew who it was before I opened it. I didn't rush. I let them wait, just long enough to remind them this wasn't their house, and I didn't owe them a thing. When I finally opened the door, Jess was standing there. Rain-dampened hair tucked into a too-expensive coat, phone clutched in one hand, her nails still painted in that hard, glossy nude color she always wore. Neutral, practical, and cold. "Anita!" she said, breathless but smiling, as if this were an ordinary visit. As if she hadn't told me 6 weeks ago to grieve, pack, and never come back. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're far from Tully Avenue." Jess laughed, light and strained. "I was just driving through. Thought I'd check on you." I said nothing. She blinked, regrouped. "Can I come in?" "No." Her smile froze. "Right. Well, maybe I'll just say what I came to say." I stepped out onto the porch, closed the door behind me. If this conversation was going to happen, it wasn't going to happen inside my house. I stood silent. Let her squirm. She cleared her throat. "Kendry and I have been talking, and we realize we might have been a little hasty." "Hasty?" I echoed. "You know, after Melton passed, emotions were running high. Everyone was overwhelmed and, look, we didn't mean to push you away. We want to make things right." She tucked her phone into her pocket, then met my eyes, trying to soften her voice. "I heard about the deal. Red Ridge." Ah, there it was. The reason she'd driven all the way to Wexford Hollow. The reason she was standing here pretending she hadn't spit venom at me 6 weeks ago. It wasn't grief. It wasn't guilt. It was greed. I didn't speak. She tried again. "We were thinking, maybe it makes more sense if we pool resources. You know, think like a family. The land's part of our heritage, right? Kendry and I even talked about setting up a family trust. We could help manage the mining operation, take care of the logistics, and in exchange, you'd move back. We could renovate the flat above the garage. You'd have privacy, a kitchenette, your own entrance." She smiled like she was offering me a gift. "Wouldn't that be better than living out here alone?" I looked at her, really looked at her. This was the same woman who wouldn't let me touch my own grandson's toys without washing my hands, who'd rolled her eyes when I brought a casserole to their new housewarming, who had called me a liability when Kendry offered to lend me his truck after Melton's first stroke. And now she wanted to stick me in a flat over her garage so she could play businesswoman with my contract? I didn't even raise my voice. "No?" Jess blinked. "I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand," I said, the cold in my voice surprising even me. "You're offering me a closet over your driveway in exchange for ownership of something you didn't even know existed until 3 days ago." Her mouth opened. I kept going. "You want control over something you mocked. You want access to money you didn't earn, and you want to disguise it as generosity." Jess's face stiffened. "Anita, come on. You're not young. That kind of money." "Hey, exactly," I cut in. "I'm not young. I've spent my whole life giving, feeding people who didn't say thank you, holding hands with people who let go the moment it wasn't convenient, financing holidays I wasn't invited to, covering for mistakes I didn't make. I gave Kendry everything I had, and now I'm giving myself the rest." She laughed once, disbelieving. "You're going to run a mining operation from out here?" "I don't have to run it. I own it." I let the words settle like dust. She didn't speak, just stood there, blinking, probably waiting for the moment I'd soften. Offer tea, open the door, slide the checkbook across the table like I always did when the tension in the room got too sharp. But I didn't. "I'm not your financial cushion," I said, straightening. "Not anymore. I won't live above your garage. I won't pretend what you did was a misunderstanding. And I certainly won't hand you the one thing in this world you tried to throw away." Jess's expression changed then. The smile faded. The careful tone vanished. What was left was the woman I'd always suspected was hiding behind the practiced charm. "You'll regret this," she said, almost too softly. "No?" I replied. "I regret not saying no sooner." She turned then, walking back to her car without another word, the soles of her designer boots crunching the gravel like broken glass. I didn't watch her leave. I opened my door, stepped back inside, and closed it gently behind me. The silence in the house was thick, but it was mine. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the creak of the wood beneath my feet. Then I walked into the kitchen, pulled out the fresh sourdough I bought yesterday, sliced it, and started breakfast. Eggs, toast, a little jam. The kind of meal no one asks for. The kind of meal you make for yourself when you're finally learning to be your own person. I ate slowly. Jess would tell Kendry I refused. They would call again. Maybe not today, but soon. They'd cycle through outrage, denial, manipulation, maybe even threats. But I wasn't scared anymore. Because for the first time in decades, I wasn't surviving someone else's life. I was living my own. And I would no longer trade it for a flat above the garage. 6 months. That's how long it took for everything to change. Not all at once. There was no flash of lightning, no crescendo of violins. Just a series of slow, steady days where things began to shift. The mine began operations in early spring, after Red Ridge finalized the permits and brought in their portable equipment. The trucks arrived with little fanfare, weaving down the gravel access road carved through the trees. Most of the noise stayed far from the house, behind the ridge. I barely heard them, unless the wind blew just right. In those first few weeks, the company had offered to relocate me temporarily, worried the work would be disruptive. I declined instead. I made a different move. With the first royalty check deposited into my personal account, a check that looked more like a small fortune than a payment, I hired a local builder, a soft-spoken man named Caleb, who came highly recommended by the town's bank manager, and we designed a new home, not a palace, not a trophy. A single-story ranch house, long and wide, tucked neatly beside the original summer property, but well beyond the tree line and far from the mine entrance. Warm hardwood floors, a screened-in porch, big windows that looked out toward the morning fog, a kitchen that opened into the living room. I chose the tile myself. No one argued about color palettes or budgets. It was the first home I had ever built for myself. Not for a husband, not for a son, not for a future I was trying to preserve. Just me. I filled the shelves with books. I started painting again. I signed up for a beginner's quilting circle in town and drove myself to the meetings in a deep blue station wagon with heated seats and a keyless start. Every 3 months, Red Ridge deposited my royalties without a single delay. The second payment was more than Kendry had made in a year. The third one surpassed that, but I didn't touch most of it. I didn't need to, a little comfort, a few luxuries. Mostly, I invested in quiet. And quiet came until Kendry called. His voice had changed since the last time we spoke. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, softer, uncertain, almost careful. Like someone walking barefoot over ground they used to stomp on without thinking. "Hey, Ma," he'd said that first time. "Just wanted to check in." No talk of loans, no veiled references to the house or the mine or the money. Just, "How are you?" I had waited for the catch, but it never came. The first call lasted 5 minutes. The next one, 10. Then a Sunday afternoon where he told me about a book he was reading, something about urban planning. We didn't discuss Jess, not at first, but eventually her name surfaced again, sharp as ever. It was late April when she called. The screen flashed her name, and I hesitated before answering. She didn't say hello. "I see what you're doing," Jess snapped, voice brittle as ice. "You've frozen us out, turned Kendry against me. You act like this sweet little country widow, but this is manipulation, financial control. You've made your point, but you don't get to rewrite history." I let the silence stretch. Then I said calmly, "Jess, I'm not interested in rewriting history. I'm just refusing to let you keep writing over mine." She scoffed. "So you're cutting us off completely?" "No," I said, my voice even. "I'm choosing how I engage. There's a difference." "Right," she spat. "Well, enjoy playing queen of your little copper castle." She hung up. She hasn't called since. And that, too, felt like a kind of peace. Kendry kept calling, though. And slowly, so slowly, I began to notice something different in him. He asked questions without ulterior motives, told me about his walks in the evening, asked what I was cooking, what I was reading. He told me once, in a voice low and unsure, "I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about the way he handled things, how quiet he was, how he always seemed to know when to speak and when to let people fall on their own." I listened then. Carefully, I said. Your father understood that love doesn't mean surrender. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke again, there was something honest in it. I don't think I really saw you until this year. I know, I said gently. Another silence. Then he asked, Do you think we'll be okay? I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. We were talking like people who wanted to rebuild. That was enough. Sometimes I still find myself looking at the contracts, the bank statements, the letters from Red Ridge. They're all filed away now in a fireproof safe, not because I need to stare at them, but because they remind me that my life took a turn after the rejection, not before it. That being sent away was the beginning, not the end. And sometimes I look at the chair on my porch, Melton's old reading chair, now cleaned and sanded down, with a thick cushion and a small side table, and I think, I didn't lose everything. I found something, not just the money, not even the independence. I found myself no longer just the wife, no longer the mother who waited quietly for someone to remember her worth. I wasn't a chapter in someone else's story anymore. I was writing my own. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the call came. Unexpected, but no longer unwelcome. Hi, Ma, Kendry said, voice softer than I remembered it ever being in his teenage years, his 30s, or even last year. You have a minute? I looked out the window. The trees were swaying gently, leaves just beginning to turn the kind of copper that reminded me of the earth below them. I do, I said. What's on your mind? A pause. Then, I wanted to tell you something before you heard it some other way. That old nervous tone was back, the one he had when he used to sneak out after curfew and come home smelling like sweat and weed and teenage shame. But this time, he wasn't a boy with scraped knees and a story. He was a man coming clean. It's over, he said. Me and Jess, we're getting divorced. I didn't speak. I let him continue. She gave me an ultimatum, said I needed to make a choice. Either I end the dependency with you, or we were finished. She called it manipulation, said I was falling under your spell. He let out a dry, short laugh. She meant the phone calls, the talks, the visits I've made without her. And? I asked. He sighed. And I told her I was done choosing people who punish me for trying to fix myself. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Maybe I'd cried too many times already. Or maybe I finally understood that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he had never known how to ask for. She took the boys to her sister's for a few weeks, he said, but I'll get them part-time. Eventually, maybe more. It's messy, but it's real. Still, I said nothing. He wasn't done. I told Noah about you, he continued. About the mine, the land. Not in numbers, but enough for him to understand that Grandma's not just an old lady in the woods. He asked if we could come see you again, said he missed your blueberry pancakes. That made me smile. I can make those, I said. Good, Kendry replied, because I missed them too. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't ache anymore, the kind that allowed space. Then, in a quieter voice, he asked, Do you think we'll be okay? This time, I had an answer. I think we might be, I said, but it's not going to be because I bail you out, or write you checks, or give you a second chance and pretend there was never a first. He exhaled, a sound that almost carried relief. I know, he said. I'm glad you're changing, Kendry, I told him. And I mean that. But I want you to understand something. I'm not going to use this money to buffer you from the consequences of decisions you still haven't worked through. That wouldn't help you. It would just give you a longer runway to crash again. He didn't argue. I'm not punishing you, I added gently. I'm protecting myself and giving you the dignity of learning to stand on your own. I deserve that, he said, voice cracking just slightly. I looked out at the ridgeline, where the machinery moved slowly behind the trees, carving carefully into the mountain like surgeons working on old bones. The copper vein was stable. The royalties were coming in like clockwork. The new home was peaceful, But this moment, this honesty between us, was worth more than 100 checks. Because this was something earned, not inherited. "You're welcome here," I said finally. "You and the boys. You can visit, you can call, you can ask for help when it's help you really need, not a shortcut out of the discomfort of your own choices. But I won't be your solution anymore. That's yours to find." He was silent for a moment, and then, "I don't think I ever understood that." "Not really." "No," I said, "but I think you're starting to." We spoke a while longer. He told me Noah had started sketching things he saw in the backyard: rabbits, cardinals, trees. That Jonah had picked up his first library book and refused to let it go, even at bedtime. We didn't mention Jess again. I knew better than to gloat, even silently. Her leaving was inevitable. She was someone who needed a story to be about her, or she'd walk out of the room. I had spent years trying to be small enough to stay out of her way. Now I understood that some people simply could not stand a woman who stopped apologizing for existing. And that's exactly what I had done. I had stopped explaining myself, stopped softening the edges of my voice, stopped cushioning people from the truth they didn't want to hear. Kendry was finally learning the hard lessons, lessons I had learned far too late. But he was learning. And maybe, just maybe, this time he would build something of his own. Not a house held up by someone else's sacrifice, not a family patched together by denial, but something real, and I'd be here to see it. Not as his savior, just as his mother.